Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, the art of the peace deal.
Trump may have said this was easy, but nobody else has.
Trump promised to end the Ukraine war within 24 hours. Why, over 100 days into his presidency, he still hasn't been able to do that? And what does it reveal about the limits of American power? I'm Natasha Del Toro, and this is The Take.
I'm Anatol Lieven. I direct the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C.
Well, Anatol, we are delighted to have you here on The Take today to talk about peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. So let's talk about President Trump. So he's been promising for a long time to end this war in Ukraine. I mean, even before he came into office, he said many times that he would do it in 24 hours. Now, obviously, that has not happened. But he's saying now that maybe they're close to a deal. Before we get into the details of that deal, maybe you could start out by just sort of doing something Donald Trump likes to do. Could you rate how his negotiations going so far?
Well, they've gone better than the Biden administration's negotiations because the Biden administration didn't engage in any negotiations. So from that point of view, obviously, Trump has moved the process forward. But I wouldn't say that we're much more than 50% of the way there.
So better than Biden, but still very much not quite as close to a deal as Trump may be wanting to project.
Well, part of the problem, I think, is that he's, as so often with Trump, he's in much too much of a hurry. I mean, he said himself that, the promise to end it in 24 hours was a joke. But still, he's looking for an early win.
So, Anatol, let's get into now some of the nitty-gritty aspects of that deal that Trump has been trying to broker between Russia and Ukraine. This is a plan that's been called the, quote, final offer. What are the key elements of that plan?
There are four that have been revealed. Trump and Witkoff, his negotiator, have said, which I think makes excellent sense, that the ceasefire line, and therefore the de facto territorial division, must run along the existing battle lines. In other words, Ukraine must give up the hope, which in fact doesn't exist anymore, of reconquering its lost territories by military force. But Russia must give up its demand that Ukraine withdraw from even more territory that Russia has not yet occupied. Sanctions against Russia would be lifted. The US, but not Ukraine, would legally recognize the Russian annexation of Crimea, but not of the other territories. And Ukraine would have to give up, formally, legally, its hope of joining NATO and would have to establish its neutrality. But, this is equally part of the plan, Ukraine would retain the right to aim for membership of the European Union. So that's the plan as far as we know it so far.
Do you think that this is a solid plan? Do you think it's a reasonable plan?
I think this is a very reasonable plan as far as it goes, because it's based on reality.
And basically, if I understand correctly, and in layman's terms, whatever land has been occupied by Russia, they get to keep so far, and they're not going to try to get more land.
Exactly. But without legal recognition. I mean, Trump has offered US legal recognition of the Russian annexation of Crimea, but the Ukrainians and Europeans will certainly not follow suit.
Now let's talk about Crimea, because I know that Crimea is an essential part of this deal and whether they're going to be able to move forward or not. The U.S. would recognize Crimea as part of Russia. Now Ukraine has flat out rejected this, right? Volodymyr Zelensky's response to this plan has been, quote, "There's nothing to talk about."
Ukraine does not legally recognize the occupation of Crimea. There's nothing to talk about. This is beyond our constitution. It's our territory, the territory of the people of Ukraine.
Ukraine would have to accept Russian control of all areas occupied since 2022. And another thing is that Ukraine would have to agree to give up on ever becoming a member of NATO. But you've argued that Ukraine should do it, and that they really can't afford not to. Why is this in Ukraine's interest?
Well, first of all, when it comes to Crimea, like the other territories, I mean, the point is that they are lost to Ukraine. Unless Russia collapses as a state, of which there is no sign, Ukraine will not get those territories back. And so it's not really conceding those territories to Russia, it's just recognizing military reality. The benefit to Russia of US legal recognition, which, by the way, may not be possible, because if it's part of a treaty, this would never get past the US Senate, so we're not sure. But what is possible is that through some form of US recognition, US sanctions can be lifted, which were imposed because of the Russian occupation of Crimea in 2014. Now, on the other issues, as part of this Trump peace proposal, and this, by the way, has been explicitly accepted by Russia, Ukraine has the chance to join the European Union. Well, now, in terms of economic development, stability, but also, in fact, a deterrent against a Russian attack, EU membership would be even more, in fact, much more beneficial to Ukraine in terms of actually joining the West than NATO membership. So this is a very major advantage for Ukraine.
But Anatol, I thought the whole idea behind joining NATO is that you're part of this organization that will protect you in the event of an attack, all of these allied forces.
Every Western government, including the Biden administration, made clear, well, two things. One, it told Zelensky before the war that we cannot guarantee that Ukraine will be a member of NATO within 5 years. It doesn't even take the US. One veto can stop NATO membership. Hungary will veto Ukraine's NATO membership. Slovakia will, probably. Turkey might very well, if it can get certain concessions from Russia. In future, if the right-wing populists win in France, France will veto Ukraine's NATO membership. But the other thing is, every government and the majority of every population has said, we will not fight to defend Ukraine. We will not send our troops to fight Russia in Ukraine. Well, that's what NATO membership means. It is a commitment to do just that. And there is no willingness for that in the West. Therefore, the offer of NATO membership was always a lie. So, I mean, in a sense, what's the point of all this talk?
That's very interesting. Thank you for clarifying about NATO, because we've been hearing that NATO membership has been such an important part of the deal for Ukraine, but it's interesting to learn that maybe it wouldn't actually be that beneficial for anyone. Now let's talk about Crimea again. So the significance of U.S. recognizing Crimea in some ways is symbolic, right? Because Russia is already controlling Crimea. And I know that there's a long history with Crimea. Russia annexed Crimea back in 2014 at a time when Ukraine and many other countries considered that annexation illegal, right? But also, if you go back several decades, Russia had given Crimea to Ukraine in 1954. Why is this such a contested piece of land? What do you get if you get Crimea?
Well, first, it wasn't Russia that gave Crimea to Ukraine in 1954.
It was Khrushchev?
Well, it was the Soviet. It was the Soviet government.
The Soviet Union. Okay, yeah. Thank you for clarifying. Right.
Transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic.
Right.
But there was, which geographically made a measure of sense, and it was a reward for Ukraine's part in defeating the Nazis in the Second World War. But there was no pretense of consultation with the population of Crimea, which is overwhelmingly Russian and Russian-speaking. So, the Russians feel that, look, it was transferred by government decree in one direction. It can be transferred back in another direction if that's what the population wants, which it seems a majority actually did want.
Defying international protests calling the process illegitimate, Crimea today went ahead with a referendum and voted overwhelmingly to join Russia.
So that puts it in a different category from the other areas of Ukraine that the Russians have occupied, which were always part of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. You asked why Crimea is so important to Russia. It's because it has a majority of Russians who want to be in Russia, but it's also because of Sevastopol, the great military port, which withstood 2 historic sieges against the British and French in the Crimean War and against the Germans in the Second World War. So it has tremendous emotional significance for Russia. But it's also, Russia's only real military port on the Black Sea, and therefore essential to the projection of Russian power in the whole Mediterranean. So there are a whole set of reasons, emotional, historic, ethnic, strategic, why Russia has always been absolutely determined to keep Sevastopol.
Mm-hmm. And even if Ukraine doesn't have to recognize that Russia now controls Crimea, isn't this deal asking Ukraine to give up 20% of its territory to Russia? I mean, what's the guarantee that Russia won't come back for the other 80%?
There are no absolute guarantees in international affairs or history. To establish total Ukrainian security against Russia, you would have to destroy Russia as a state, abolish it, break it up. Well, A, that's not going to happen, but secondly, the result of that would be a nuclear war in which we'd all die. The point is, Ukraine cannot militarily reconquer this territory unless NATO and the United States send in an army to fight against Russia. And once again, every Western government has made clear that we will not do that. Well, at that point, it's not a question of giving anything to Russia, and certainly not a question of legally recognizing, Russian annexation. It's a question of the analysis, which frankly depends in the end on simply cold military analysis of whether Ukraine can reconquer this territory. By now, the overwhelming majority of military analysts, if you read them, say that the Ukrainians cannot. I mean, some people are still saying that they can, but very few, given the imbalance of resources, of population, the failure of, by now, 2 Ukrainian offensives So this is simply the military reality.
More with Anatol after the break. Before we continue today's show, I wanted to talk to you about Hindsight, a dramatized history show from Al Jazeera podcast. We have a season 7 beginning on Wednesday, May 7th. But in the meantime, you can catch up with season 6 right here on the Al Jazeera YouTube podcast tab and listen to all the other seasons wherever you get your podcasts. Here's a preview of season 7.
I want to sing, Hassan. That's all I want.
Hindsight, a dramatized history podcast from Al Jazeera.
Have you seen what the British have done? They have stabbed us in the back.
I'm your narrator, Charles Dance. In season 7, we meet people from the Arab world, including dynastic leaders.
I was in my early 20s and running Egypt.
Under my rule, Muslims will retake our lands from foreign invaders.
And artists, like the famed French-Algerian writer Albert Camus.
There is something deeply absurd about the search for meaning.
At that moment, I was no longer Amal al-Atrash. I became Asmahan.
Egypt's sisters in crime.
We were mere spectators who provided food and drinks.
We're not killers.
You've heard of them.
My name is pronounced Salah ad-Din.
I am Shagarat ad-Dur, Sultana of Egypt.
Now it's time to hear from them.
You may call me Faisal.
My name is Raya Ali Hammam.
I am Skin Ali Hammam.
Hindsight, a dramatized history podcast from Al Jazeera. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
So Anatol, we've talked about why Ukraine isn't on board with this plan. But what about Russia? I mean, how receptive has Putin been to Trump's plan?
Well, partially yes, as you can see from his statement about giving up further territorial demands on Ukraine, and in terms of therefore freezing the existing ceasefire line, which is not what Russia was previously demanding. Receptive, it appears, to the idea that you will not get legal recognition of the Russian-occupied territories, receptive to the idea that NATO membership is out, but willing to agree to EU membership if the Ukrainians can achieve it. But there are still these huge issues that we just don't know what Putin's position is now or how far he's willing to compromise. The question of the rights of Russians in Ukraine. Are the Russians still demanding a ban on Ukrainian political parties and even regime change in Kiev? And most important of all, the question of military limits on the Ukrainian army. Because previously the Russians were demanding that the Ukrainian army be reduced to such a level that it couldn't actually defend Ukraine. Well, that's totally unacceptable. So we still have to see, how far the Russians are prepared to compromise on that.
So earlier this week, we saw a meeting between President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky at Pope Francis's funeral. And they spoke privately. They were, faced, sitting directly across from one another. And it seemed a lot calmer. And both have said since that the conversation was productive. Obviously, a very different tone from the meeting that they had in the Oval Office with J.D. Vance.
And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
There's also the shift that President Trump has taken when talking about Putin, a leader he's obviously openly admired, and now who he's started to openly criticize. I do want to mention also that hours after Zelensky and Trump sat down and talked in Italy, Russia launched drone attacks in civilian areas of Ukraine, killing a 12-year-old girl. And shortly after that, Trump posted, he went on Truth Social.
The US President Donald Trump posted this on Truth Social. There was no reason for Putin to be shooting missiles into civilian areas, cities and towns over the last few days. It makes me think that maybe he doesn't want to stop the war. He is just tapping me along.
So we're seeing some changes happening in real time and how Trump is negotiating with the leaders of these two countries. How do you read this shift, and how Trump is approaching both of them?
Well, he when one side is being more recalcitrant, he puts pressure on them. When the other side is being more recalcitrant, he puts pressure on them. I mean, for all the crudity of Trump's approach, it makes a good deal of sense. Zelensky started by treating Trump the way that he basically treated Biden and European governments, which was, appealing over their heads to their populations and media, bringing moral pressure to bear on them by, stressing Russia's evil and so forth. And that just, Trump didn't like that. That doesn't work with Trump. Trump is in many ways a kind of medieval monarch, or would-be medieval monarch. There was this business of, Zelensky turning up, to the White House in his semi-military shirt. Trump didn't like that. You're supposed to show respect. And now I think Zelensky is showing respect. And so, Trump is therefore willing to be amicable. But the ball is, I think, once again, more in Russia's court. And if Russia is not prepared to agree to a permanent ceasefire at this stage, which I don't think it is, then Trump and Witkoff, have to come up with a concrete agreement on these other unsolved issues, which Russia has to accept. Or I think, yes, I think Trump will walk away from the peace process. And I think that at that point, if it is Russia that, has refused, that US aid to Ukraine will continue. And then the war will continue, and we will simply have to see what happens on the battlefield.
So going back to, the United States involvement here and trying to broker a deal between Russia and Ukraine to end this war, do you think that we are seeing the limits of the U.S. leverage in a conflict that seems to have no easy solutions? I mean, and also Donald Trump has sort of presented himself as this great deal maker. He wrote The Art of the Deal. Is he having a little more trouble with the art of the peace deal?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, peace deals are immensely more complicated than, than property deals. But of course, yes. I mean, the US does lack full leverage, certainly against Russia, because the key leverage with Russia would be if Trump could credibly threaten to send the US army into Ukraine to attack the Russian army there. But as I say, Biden wouldn't do that. Trump certainly won't do it, and the American people do not want it. So, against Russia, you have the two things of continued US aid and, of course, US sanctions as pressure. And the US could intensify sanctions to some extent, but of course, only some extent, because the US is also simply not nearly as relatively economically powerful as it was 30 years ago. And there is China, there is India, there are other countries which are determined to go on trading with Russia and buying Russian energy. Now, of course, US leverage over Ukraine is much bigger because Ukraine is so dependent on US military aid and especially US intelligence. But that is, a difficult one because, of course, if the US does stop that aid and Ukraine suffers a catastrophic defeat as a result, well, this will also be embarrassing and humiliating for the US. So, yes, I mean, it is difficult. The thing is, Trump may have said this was easy, but nobody else has. But I'm pretty confident that if we don't get a peace settlement, we will resume negotiations by the end of this year, possibly next year, and eventually both sides will simply be exhausted and they will want the US to broker some form of deal. I mean, I hate to use the phrase indispensable nation, which has been, so monstrously misused and overused. But the truth of the matter is that I think, in Ukraine, it probably is only the United States that can broker a deal, because nobody else has either the unity, the will, or the leverage to do so.
Well, we'll see if Trump is able to do it now or if it's going to be something down the road. But it certainly seems like whatever deal they come up with, not everybody is going to be happy in the end with the terms.
Nobody is going to be fully happy.
Right.
The only question is just how unhappy they will be.
Well, Anatol, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
And that's The Take. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to give it a like so more people can find it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know what stood out to you, or if there's anything that you'd like us to dive into deeper next time. I'm always checking, so let's keep the conversation going. See you next time.